Hello and welcome to the podcast, which this week investigates the case of the disappearing public service programming. It may be out there, but in this age of streaming, can you find it? And how do we know if it is out there? Step forward, Catherine Johnson, Professor of Media and Communications at the University of Leeds and co-author of the report Behind the Screen, How Streaming is Changing Public Service Media, which is published this week. The report is produced by the University of Leeds and the International Broadcasting Trust, IBT, in partnership with the Campaign for the Arts and the Sandford St Martin Trust. Welcome back to the podcast, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much for having me on again, Roger.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I hope you're going to tell me how I can find, if I can find, public service programming on the streamers, because this is quite an extraordinary report you've published. Let's start at the beginning. In the past, of course, if you'd said, is there public service programming, you get a copy of the Radio Times, you'd go through it and you'd add it all up, and if you had some assiduous student, they'd go through every copy, we'd know where we were, and then Ofcom would report and say, yeah, we've looked at this is what they've done, and so on. Are we now in uncharted waters?
We absolutely are. So the important context for this is that the Media Act, which your regular listeners will be familiar with, I'm sure, but that introduced new regulation last year that allowed public service broadcasters to fulfil their remit on their video on demand service like iPlayer and ITVX. BBC could always do it on iPlayer, but the commercial public service broadcasters didn't. Their remits weren't covered on their VOD services. So this is a new bit of legislation, and that's increasingly what they're doing anyway. So then the question is, how are they fulfilling those, and can we measure it? And I mean, the fundamental answer for that is no, we can not without quite a lot of money and a lot of technical skill. And so even with our team of researchers, it was incredibly challenging to be able to find out what they were providing on their VOD services and how prominent certain kinds of programs were.
And is anybody else doing this, or is it just you?
There are other little pockets of research in this area. So there have been some other studies on iPlayer, just trying to see what's in the catalogue. And there are some studies overseas trying to look at what's in other European public service broadcasters, and also things like Netflix, what's in their catalogues. So there are little pockets of research happening, but nothing particularly coordinated.
Well, it sounds a bit as if we're flying blind. And when I attended your launch on Monday, I think you said, we doubt whether we can do this exercise again. So, every year we used to get a report from Ofcom what's been done. You are in a way filling the gap. But what you're saying is you can't continue to fill that gap.
Absolutely. I mean, we got some funding from Research England to do this research. It was a bit under £60,000. So we can't get that funding again next year or ongoing. And part of the reason that it's particularly challenging is because we lack public access to some of the core data. So the technologies and the techniques that we have to use are then a lot more time consuming because we have to scrape the data from their VOD services.
So when you go, for example, to ITV or to BBC, let's take ITV, and you say, we'd like the data because, in the Media Act, you've got to do, I think the word is appropriate or something like that, public service programming. You've asked them for the data. Do they give it to you?
No. So the Media Act says they have to provide an appropriate range of genres, and public service remit content has to be easily discoverable and findable. So we approached all of the public service broadcasters to ask them if they could share any of their catalogue data and any audience data. ITV said that all of that data was commercially sensitive and that they couldn't share it with us. Channel 4, shout out, they gave us their catalogue data, and the BBC shared with us in confidence some aggregated audience data, just about like which bits of the homepage people see most and click on most.
So if it's a public service broadcaster, you thought it would be obliged to declare to the public what it was doing. And you're saying, let's take the example of ITV, a straightforward refusal to do that. And when we were at your launch on Monday, we heard the ITV representative say that ITVX, which is the equivalent in a way to BBC iPlayer, is not public service. I mean, did I hear correctly?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't have to be public service. And then with the Media, they can choose whether they want it to be designated as public service remit or not. And that is a decision for ITV. I think that their position is that all of the content that they provide is public service, but particularly programmes that originated in the UK and so on. And so that they're quite confident that they are fulfilling their remit. But the question is, even if we say that ITV's remit is just providing a certain proportion of UK originated programmes prominent in its interface, at the moment, the only way I can see that that is going to be measured is by ITV telling Ofcom what it's done.
And is it telling Ofcom what it's done?
Well, it would have to if it decides to designate, but then it's effectively marking its own homework, because how is Ofcom going to check that what it's saying is correct? And I'm not accusing the public service broadcasters of lying, but there is accountability and transparency, a core public service values, and they are the foundation of trust in public service media. And in the context of declining trust, this is a key aspect of accountability to the public.
Yes, because it's one thing to argue that how they should behave, I feel like, with their programming, given the commercial pressures they're under. It's another thing to say, we're not going to give you the information so you know what's happening. I mean, we must have the right to know what's happening, or else there can't be a debate. And you're saying at the moment, increasingly, we don't have the information.
Absolutely. And, Ofcom said when the Media Act was passed that it would continue to monitor the genres that were previously listed in the Communications Act but were removed from the Media Act. And that includes genres like programmes about religion and belief, international issues, science and nature, comedy, music, arts, and so on. They're not the only programmes that make up public service broadcasting, but they are core genres that support the civic function of public service media. In their review of public service media, looking back over 2019 to 2023, they had data on how much money public service broadcasters had spent on different genres, including religion and ethics and specialist and factual. And they included data on number of hours that they produced, but there was nothing on how discoverable that content is. And the Media Act says that public service remit content has to be discoverable. So there is a question for Ofcom here. How are you going to measure how discoverable public service remit content is?
Well, let's look at this discoverability issue. I mean, streaming is increasing. So the direction of travel is clearly that we'll all be streamers one day virtually. And the only debate is how quickly, but it's happening. That's happening. The second thing is that when you stream something, the broadcasters have this concept of personalisation. I suppose, like Amazon, they see which books that you buy and they say, we got other books like that, we'll give it to you. So personalisation of television works in a similar way, doesn't it? The streamers look at what you're watching and they say, you're interested in crime, we've got more of that. Would you like this? What they don't do is say, here I'm more interested in crime, but by the way, there's this really interesting program about the arts or music or whatever. So if you, as a streamer, want to find public service content, it looks as if the streaming organizations themselves are not going to tell you, are they? I mean, let's break this down a bit into the BBC, because the BBC has a bit of a better record on this, doesn't it? But if I wanted to go on to the stream the BBC output, and I wanted to find something about, let's say, religion and belief, how easy would that be with the BBC?
Okay, that would be really difficult. But just before I answer that, I just want to say on personalisation that from what our research shows, personalisation is more of an issue on iPlayer than on the other public service broadcasters, VOD services, which seem to have less sophisticated personalisation algorithms at work. And it's also worth recognising that on all four of the broadcasters we looked at, ITV, BBC, Channel 4, Channel 5, personalisation and curation work together. And curation is not necessarily the solution either, because curation can also work to limit what people watch. So those caveats aside, let's look at religion and belief. So if you go onto the homepage of the BBC iPlayer, you're going to see a very small, tiny proportion of programmes about religion and belief. So it's not going to be made prominent to you on the homepage, or very, very small amount is going to be made prominent on the homepage. So then what you could do is go, it's got this kind of categories section, browse section, let's go there. But there's no category for religion and belief, even though the BBC does have on its programmes webpage a category for religion and belief, but it doesn't make that category available on iPlayer. So then you think, I'll go and search. Now, actually, iPlayer performed well on search. So if you search for particular programs, it was really good at surfacing different kinds of programs there. So big tick for iPlayer there. And then there's like trailers and recommendations. So maybe you're watching other things. If you're watching something on iPlayer, you're interested in religion and belief, maybe something will be recommended around it. Unless you're already watching that programming, it's not going to recommend anything to you.
One of the great things about the past was, or the theory of the past was, that yes, because there's a license fee, the programming should be provided that you want. But at the same time, programming should be available that you might not realize you want until you see it. And then you think, wow, that's fascinating. I'd like to follow that up. Now, on a linear schedule, schedulers could try and introduce you to a subject, put a popular program, and after it put something rather less popular, but whatever. That goes out the window once the individual is their own scheduler, in a sense. So if you believe in public service broadcast, you still believe that the public service broadcaster have an obligation to make sure that the individual consumer knows and has the opportunity of experimenting with certain areas of programming. Now, BBC patchy record, but when we looked at ITV, for example, somebody said there wasn't a single program to be found about Muslims on ITV. So whether you had a search or not on ITVX, you wouldn't have found it. Is that right?
Yeah, in terms of what we tried to find in the catalogue, from what we were looking at in the catalogue, there was actually, across all of the broadcasters, most of the religion and ethics programs was about Christianity, and then secondly about Judaism. We didn't find any programs about Hinduism, a really major religion in the UK, and very little about Islam and so on. So that was an issue. The other thing that's worth stating about the BBC that we thought was particularly concerning, we created personalised accounts, so an account that just watched programmes about religion and ethics, one that just watched programmes about international issues, one that just watched programmes about the arts. And then we had a general account, and that general account, it just watched what was pushed. So what's at the top of the homepage, first or second rail on the left. So the bits that we know are most clicked on. And then we also looked at a clean account, so an account that had done no viewing at all. And what we found was that if you were on those specialised accounts and you were watching the programmes, the algorithm would feed you more of those programmes. If you were on the general account, the amount of those programmes that iPlayer fed you went down by 50%. So it halved your chance of watching programs from those genres. So it's actively working against you trying to find things that you might not initially have expressed an interest in.
So you'd have no trouble finding a big drama series the BBC's pushing, that'll be there. You would have trouble finding a lot of public service interest. I mean, we mentioned religion and belief. Of course, you were also investigating coverage of the arts and foreign reporting, and you made the point a lot of that is very much presenter-led and so on. But you say the danger is clear in your foreword. As these genres recede further from view, the inevitable decline in viewing figures will trigger further cuts and result in fewer commissions. That's the danger. Is Ofcom prepared to do anything about that? I mean, this word, PBSs must do appropriate. Well, but they don't specify what and they don't specify how much. So that we can absolutely see a situation where somebody's, people are under financial pressure across the board in ITV with the license fee going down, and they're saying, look, we're successful here. Nobody's watching these programs. Why are you spending money on this? Nobody's watching them. So it becomes self-fulfilling. You don't advertise them. People don't know they're there. They don't get made. I mean, it's a death spiral.
Yeah.
I don't want to exaggerate, but it's not far off a death spiral, isn't it?
It is potentially a death spiral. And I would say let's look at children's. So at the moment, Ofcom is really pushing for the importance of children's programming. And that's on the back of about 15 years of it being completely off the agenda. And so the remit for children's programming was really removed for the commercial broadcasters. It was really downplayed. And basically, the children's television market just fell apart and the amount of children's programming really disappeared. And so now Ofcom is like, oh my goodness, that's a problem. Let's put children's back on the agenda. But there is a risk that the same thing is going to happen with these programmes. And Ofcom's report showed that the biggest declines in terms of number of hours produced is in specialist factual, arts, classical music and children's. So it's focusing on children's, but it's completely ignoring these other genres that are also important to public service media.
And that has a real problem if you're involved in production, let alone with so much production out of house. Let's look at the independent companies, which are doing rather more. You may have, in the best will of the world, a set of programs you're meant to make, but you can only make what's commissioned. And I was very struck when we had interviewed the producer of Mr. Bates and the Post Office on this podcast a few months ago. And he said, well, first of all, didn't make any money from it at all. He didn't even get paid himself as a producer, but he can't afford to do it anymore. And what he has to do for his company's sake, is to do multi-episode crime series with the possibility of their return. Now, he'll produce great things, but we're not exactly short of crime programs, are we? But if you're an independent and you can only make what's commissioned, that's what you have to do. So unless there's somebody saying, we will guarantee we will make program in the music arts area or in religion and belief, now you'll have to compete for it, but we will do that. That's fine. And also the problem with children's is that it's one thing to have one broadcaster making it. But again, you need 2 or 3 broadcasters doing both to be able to say, well, that commissioner doesn't like that idea, but actually it's rather good. Well, go to another commissioner. You have the possibility. If you don't have a sort of, what can we say, a basic amount of programming that can be made in this area, independent producers will go elsewhere in the source of what they want to make. It's almost inevitable, otherwise they won't exist.
And a lot of the specialist programming that we're talking about comes from smaller independent production companies, not from the big super indies anyway, who are already well placed to get commissions from the likes of Netflix and Amazon and so on. So there is also a risk here that there's going to be, we know that the independent production sector in the UK is in crisis. Was it last year 70% of freelancers, I think, were out of work or experienced long periods out of work. So if there's a decline in the production of this kind of specialist factual, it's going to affect the smaller, more precarious end of the market anyway.
I mean, the thing that's frustrating about this, it was all foreseeable anyway. But anyway, at the end of your forward, I want to come to your recommendations because we're going to be positive here. But let me a final bit of doom watch, really. In your foreword, you say, our findings do raise serious concerns about the transparency and accountability of PSBs to the public, civil society, regulators, and government. We hope this report will begin a process of opening up these platforms to far greater scrutiny, so we can, at the very least, understand what is available, discoverable, and prominent. Now, you're very well placed because you're chair also of the DCMS Stakeholders Forum on audience working groups and so on. And I don't want to make your political position rather difficult, but do you think these issues are seized upon, that Ofcom and government and opposition and the select committees in Parliament really understand the scale of this crisis?
So just to clarify, I'm chair of the Audiences Working Group for the DCMS Stakeholder Forum on the Future of TV Distribution. That's a real mouthful. I appreciate it.
Thank you for correcting it.
Okay.
But do you think those people who we rely upon to raise and debate and discuss and ultimately decide on these issues are seized of the urgency of this?
I think that Ofcom recognises the urgency of the position for public service media in the UK. And they launched a report, which is the result of their review of public service media on Monday, which was called, I think, Transmission Critical. So they are saying this is a critical moment. And I have been at events where there is a fair amount of recognition that we have. I said at an event recently, we've got 10 years to save public service media. And someone from the sector came back and said, no, we've got 3 years to save public service media. The question is, I think, what we do to address it. And I think what I worry about is that there is less interest in preserving the civic and social function of public service media than there is in just ensuring that it is commercially viable, and that there is less political interest and will in looking at solutions outside of the easy mechanisms that you can do, which is what you tell the public service broadcasters to do. So because the public service broadcasters are already regulated, it's easier to add more onto their regulation. It's much harder to think about regulating beyond, regulating the sector more widely. But the bottom line is that we had a sector that was quite well regulated across the piece. And we had regulations that supported public service media, but that were across the sector. And now we have significant parts of the sector that fall outside of a lot of core regulation, not all of it, but a lot of it. And for me, I think we need that ambitious thinking. I have said this many, many times, and I'm just going to keep saying it. It is complicated. The IPTV, internet protocol, internet distributed television world is much, much more complicated. There are more risks of unintended consequences. There are more stakeholders. And so it is more complicated, which is why it really needs to be looked at rather than just avoided because it's too difficult.
Of course, some of this would involve the tech giants. And we know from the negotiations with Donald Trump, etc., that they're whispering in the ear that trade deals with the UK should, on the whole, be put side by side with a relaxation or certainly not an introduction of anything that might inhibit them. So, I see the nature of the problem. Let's be more positive then. Let's look at your recommendations, if I may, on this. I mean, you've got 6 recommendations. The first is that all PSBs should be required to publish an annual statement setting out the principles and values underpinning their use of algorithms and recommendation systems within BVOD platforms. Why is that so crucial?
So we don't know what algorithms they're using, how they're using them, and in what way. So ITV can tell us, well, actually, ITVX isn't particularly algorithmically driven, but we don't know. And the only way we can try to find out is through lengthy reverse engineering of the kind that we were trying to do. The government has published an algorithmic transparency recording standard. So the public service broadcasters could sign up to that. That provides a framework within which to record the transparency of their algorithms. Government is asking that all public services adopt that as a standard.
And then you said the media regulator, Ofcom, needs to clarify how it will monitor the availability, prominence and discoverability of genres that were removed from public service remits by the Media Act of 2024. Well, everyone shouldn't they? You've talked about the PSBs working together to establish a culture of transparency. Well, on the basis of what we've said in your report, they need to do that too. This is rather difficult. Your 4th recommendations. PSB should facilitate the monitoring of their platforms by civil society organizations, charities, researcher, audience groups, etc., by opening access to software protocols, APIs, and non-commercially sensitive platform and audience data. Now, they will fight you every inch on the way there. Why is that so important?
Well, it's really important because if they can provide access to core data, it makes it much easier for us to be able to continue to monitor. So one of the things that we would really like to do is to be able to develop some kind of tool or even some basic training that we can pass on to civil society organisations so that they can continue to do the monitoring that they have been doing for the last decades, but are going to be unable to do. And we don't think that there should be massive barriers here, because not only should there be, in terms of accountability, a public responsibility on broadcasters to do this, but there are mechanisms by which they can share that data, which doesn't mean that it's just made available to absolutely everybody and all their competitors can see it, So there are mechanisms for sharing it via Ofcom or making it available to researchers for specific uses and in particular ways with confidentiality mandates around those as well.
Do you think that, in the forthcoming discussion of the BBC Charter, we've talked about this, or I've obsessed about this on the programme before, that before we talk about the BBC, before we talk about how to fund it, we need a wider public debate about what is public service, what we want from public service, media, we better call it, and rather broadcast in the future, and how the best way of delivering it and so on. Yeah, we have, I don't want to put you in political difficulty, but we have a culture secretary who's particularly happy to call for the resignation of the Director General over an issue. But I'm not aware of this wide or of determination in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport to initiate such a discussion. Do you get a sense anywhere in Whitehall that there's a recognition that this is the future discussion of the BBC should, as it were, take part after a discussion about public service broadcasting or media going forward?
I think the key point that you're making there is around what we want public service media to do, what we want it to be. And I think that there needs to be more discussion of that from Ofcom, and there needs to be more discussion from that from government. As I've said, Ofcom seems to be putting forward quite a narrow view of what public service broadcasting should do, which is focused on news and current affairs, children's programming, and then programming made across the nations and regions. And that's it, really. And I think that that's not sufficient, but also we need much more of a debate about that. And I think the broadcasters should also be participating in that debate. I think Charter Review is a real opportunity to think about those values. And I would like those values to not just include things like the kinds of programs we want them to make, but also to include things like transparency, accountability, and also independence. The BBC and public service broadcasters need to be more independent from political interference.
And finally, just the last recommendation I want to pick up, you say the government and regulator needs to incentivize PSBs to broaden the range of genres and subject matter promoted and recommended to audiences, recognizing the civic value of serendipity in public service media and the dangers of creating audience silos. In other words, serendipity being you come across things you hadn't thought of doing, oh gosh, but you're interested in. Now, I know you very much hope that happens, but how does the government and the regulator incentivize PSBs? Because we are in a situation where if you take ITV at the moment, there is or was a very serious discussion about whether there's any point in being a PSB anymore. So how do you incentivize?
I mean, I think that you need to think about what are the rewards for what is done. So I think that is the whole question. So when the Media Act was going through, ITV's position is we need prominence regulation in order to continue to fulfill our remit. And now part of that bargain was that they should make public service remit content prominent on their own VOD service in exchange for prominence. Now they seem to be saying, well, that's not good enough.
And it's not prominent. Yeah, it's not prominent,
exactly.
Is it?
So I think there's a question there. It is interesting to think about what are the incentives, and this is where I would be thinking about that wider regulation. In what ways can the government look at making the media market more fair for public service broadcasters and say, well, if we put this in place, then we're going to ask you to do X, Y, and Z. We can take a country like Belgium, right? Flanders, tiny, tiny market. Their public service broadcaster is required to produce a taste broadening algorithm, which they have designated. And what that does is it gives you a score depending on how broad your viewing is on their VOD platform. And then it nudges you. So it doesn't say, oh, well, you're only watching documentaries about the Second World War, so we're going to recommend you something completely different, a piece of classical music. It says, oh, right, you're only watching documentaries about the Second World War, but you like documentaries. Let's recommend you a documentary about something slightly different, but perhaps by the same presenter or by the same team or something like that. And they found that that's broadening out what people are viewing. So it's a way of actively mandating that the broadcasters think about ways of doing this, ways of broadening that out. So it doesn't have to be a taste broadening algorithm, but it does show that it can be done. But it could include requirements to broaden out or widen or encourage people to broaden what they view.
Well, I hope that your report is on the desk of the Secretary of State, that she reads it. Professor Catherine Johnson, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roger.
Our thanks to Professor Cathy Johnson, and a link to her report can be found in the description of this programme. That's it for the summer, but we'll be back in September, which will be the beginning of our 4th year of this podcast. And arguably it could be our most important year, as charter renewal will be focusing minds. Please do consider supporting our journalism. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/Beebwatch for £1.99 per month. It also entitles you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. You don't have to read it, but it might be worth it once in a while. I'll try to make sure it is. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. This broadcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and is produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Have a good summer. See you next time. Goodbye.